Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you find yourselves on the Earth's surface today. Before we begin, as a reflection of University of Sydney's recognition of the deep history and culture of the land on which it was built, I would like to acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. Then they stand on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also extend this acknowledgement to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people online with us today. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are and pay respects to their elders past, present, and future. My name is Gorana Grgic, and I'm a senior lecturer at the United States Study Center in the Department of Government and International Relations. And today it is my great pleasure that I'll be able to talk about some of the areas that have interested me as a researcher, as a scholar, but also that I believe many of you, if you are followers of international politics and global affairs, for work or for punishment, would have had a hard time escaping. What I'm talking about is the kind of very palpable change of the dominant paradigm when it comes to studying and analyzing interstate relations over the good part of the past decade. Namely, while it's not really kind of been determined what the exact date might be when we change the paradigm, it's these days safe to say that we find ourselves in an era of great power competition. Challenges to the United States, particularly when it comes to its relations with China and with Russia, are frequently and sometimes adamantly argued to constitute a new Cold War. And who better to talk to than to one of America's leading historians of US foreign policy and a former Pentagon advisor who has spent a good part of the past couple of years certainly thinking about these things, about the lessons of Cold War and the way that they apply to the United States today. So with great pleasure, I have with me Professor Hal Brands, who has just recently published his latest monograph called The Twilight Struggle, What the Cold War Teaches Us About the Great Power Rivalry Today. Hal is the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a prolific and regular columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. And prior to his academic career, or in between his academic careers, he served as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning in the latter years of the Obama administration. And he has also served as a lead writer for the Commission on the National Defense Strategy for the US and consulted with a range of government offices and agencies in the intelligence and national security communities. So before we kick off our conversation, just a couple of housekeeping notes for you today. We do encourage you to become part of this discussion and ask questions as we go along. This can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A box that you can see on your screens. You can then ask and vote for questions, and a selection of them I will make sure that they get answered, particularly towards the end of our discussion. And apart from this event being streamed on Zoom and YouTube, we are recording it for later access on the US Study Center's media channels. So you can go back and rewatch us, or if you can't make it all the way to the end, you can certainly find us there very swiftly after we are done with the seminar, with the webinar today. So that's all about the logistics. Now we are kicking off the conversation in earnest. So Hal, you have been a regular feature of a lot of podcasts that I subscribed to over the past couple of months. And obviously, this is all part of your book tour. And I've really struggled to kind of find a kickoff question that isn't really, what brought you to writing this book or what motivated you to write this book. I hope we get to that answer. But when we talk about Cold War parallels, what I am interested in from your point of view, sitting in DC or thereabouts, what would you say, where is the United States these days? Are we kind of, in terms of the early post-World War II period, are we closer to 45 or to 50, closer to the long telegram of 46 or the X article of 47? What's the kind of consensus, would you say? Do we have a strategy that has been figured out, or are we just in kind of the kind of, we have a sense of what the paradigm is, but we are still looking for a strategy?
Well, it's a great question to start with, and thank you, Gorana, for having me here. As you know, I'm a fan of your work, so it's a good opportunity to have a conversation. With respect to the particular question, I think we're in a little bit of an in-between space right now in Washington, and so what's interesting about the early Cold War is that you go from the end of World War II, the late summer of 1945, and it's only about 6 months before George Kennan writes the long telegram in early 1946, which is seen to provide, I guess, the problem diagnosis that underlies the containment policy. And then it's another 16 months or so before he publishes the X article. In the interim, you'd had the Truman Doctrine, you'd had the Marshall Plan, you'd had a variety of things that both start laying the intellectual groundwork for containment, but then also laying the policy groundwork, putting together concrete policies that began the process of building the post-war order and containing the Soviet Union. And so it's the point, I guess, is that it was actually a pretty compressed period of time between the end of World War II and the emergence of the containment strategy, even though the strategy itself evolved considerably over the years and decades that followed. So where are we today? Well, in some ways, we are further advanced than we were in, say, 1947, in the sense that a lot of the tools that we might use to compete with China already exist, right? And so at the beginning of the Cold War, there was no NATO, right? There was no global network of US military alliances. The whole infrastructure of the post-war order was very nascent, if it existed at all. That's different today. And when we think about the institutions, for instance, that we might use to compete with China, many of them already exist. The alliances already exist. Institutions like the Quad or AUKUS exist or have been created recently. We're trying to use groups like the Group of Seven on economic and infrastructure issues. And so in that sense, the policy discussion is perhaps more advanced than it was in 1947, but in other ways, it's not quite as advanced as it was in 1947. And so I think we've achieved consensus in the United States that we have a problem vis-a-vis China, that our expectations of what China would become during the post-Cold War era have not been fulfilled, that we face a serious challenge from a country that is becoming increasingly explicit about its desire to be the primary power in Asia and globally, eventually. But where I think we are not as far along is that no one has really articulated, at least in government, at least publicly, the theory of victory that would be equivalent to what Kennan enunciated in the X article in particular. And so the X article, just for reference, I mean, it was about 90% diagnosis, but it was about 10% prescription, and basically said, here's how the United States and its friends will ultimately win this competition: by holding the line until and exerting counter pressure until the Soviet Union, until the regime basically either collapses from within or mellows. We haven't had that level of clarity in dealing with China, in part because I think there's a lot of disagreement over what success in this competition looks like. And so perhaps that's another subject we can talk about. But in that respect, I think we're still sort of, the parallel would be, late 1945, early 1946.
That's great. And then maybe on that question of a consensus, you've written much about how there wasn't a lot of consensus actually on containment of the Soviet Union, as many now assume there is. And kind of in hindsight, it all seemed to have fallen into place. But even Kennan later on became a sort of critic of containment. And it certainly faced criticism on both left and the right for either being too harsh or not harsh enough. So optimally, when we talk about consensus, what are you hoping this consensus to bring, and what are potentially some perils down the line as we see it develop?
Yeah, we engage in a lot of retrospective myth making about the Cold War, and I think you touched on two of the biggest myths. I mean, one myth is that we were always united as a nation or as a free world in trying to contain Soviet influence. That wasn't true. There were angry debates about containment and its various manifestations. And the other myth, of course, is that containment was sort of set down in stone in 1947 and remained that way for the next 42 or 44 years. And in reality, what containment meant in practice varied a lot from administration to administration. And a number of presidents came into office hoping to reject or planning on rejecting the concept before they kind of made their way back to it. So when we think about a consensus in the US-China competition, it'll be a similarly messy consensus if one does in fact take shape and endure. And so the United States, there's bipartisan consensus today that China is America's foremost geopolitical competitor. Across the political spectrum, views of China have become much more negative over the past 5 years, and particularly over the past 2 years as a result of COVID. And there's furthermore a consensus that the United States is not doing enough to protect its interests vis-a-vis China today. But that's about where the consensus ends. And so, there are big debates over what sort of industrial or technological policy the United States should pursue. There are debates over when we think the Chinese challenge to the balance of power in the Western Pacific will become most severe. There are debates about how thoroughly the United States should prioritize the China challenge versus the Russia challenge or other legacy threats that the United States and its allies confront. And obviously, the China issue is going to become deeply politicized in the United States. That's just the nature of our political system. And that was the case really throughout the Cold War. The period of true bipartisan agreement on Cold War policy lasted about 2 years, from early 1947 to the 1948 election. So I think when we think about a consensus, we need to understand that, consensus doesn't imply perfect continuity, and it doesn't imply perfect agreement. And in fact, it would be a problem if it did, because one of the advantages of the American political system and of democratic political systems more broadly is that they create lots of room for debate about specific policies, even when you have agreement on an overarching objective. You asked about the dangers of consensus. There is always the danger that foreign policy becomes politicized in an unhelpful way. That perhaps there will come a point in the U.S.-China relationship where what is really needed is to decrease the intensity of the rivalry and focus on common interests. It's sort of hard to foresee now, but that could happen. And you could theoretically find that the China issue has become so deeply embedded in American politics that that's difficult to do. There are obviously parallels during the Cold War in the sense that there were times where anti-communism was weaponized for really destructive political ends in the United States. You can think of the McCarthy period, for instance. So there are certainly dangers to this as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point in terms of just the domestic implications. Some of them I've also heard you allude to have even led to more progressive reforms in the United States, but equally McCarthyism being obviously the opposite example. So when we talk about containment not being a monolith and really being kind of vague in some sense, that you could actually kind of play around with the various the kind of instruments that are being used, or kind of the focus on particular relations and so on. So we definitely can think about the periods of easing tensions, the detente under Nixon, a good part of or most of Carter's presidency, and then again the kind of escalating tension and rollback under Reagan. You already mentioned that presidential leadership matters a lot in figuring out where the kind of road might take the strategy, if you will. But do you see any other factors that might actually accelerate some of the kind of, either the competition and assertiveness, or the easing of the tensions that we've seen over the past couple of years?
I think this is one of the big debates in U.S. foreign policy, particularly within the Democratic Party today. And it's interesting, COVID obviously accelerated the U.S.-China rivalry in a really significant way. And so prior to March 2020, I think President Trump was actually pretty ambivalent about China policy. He was putting lots of economic pressure on China and calling it out rhetorically. But I think his objective was really to get sort of a deeper, more comprehensive economic relationship with China, and the phase one trade deal that was signed in January 2020, just as we were all starting to hear about this thing called COVID, was a good example of that. Trump turns around dramatically, really beginning in March and April 2020, when he realizes what the pandemic is going to do to the United States, and frankly is going to do to his re-election prospects. And so if you talk to people who served in the Trump administration, what they'll often say is that they were able to get more done on China policy in the 9 months after March 2020 than they were able to do in the 3 years prior to that, in terms of technological sanctions, in terms of the campaign against Huawei, in terms of a variety of other things. And so we saw COVID act as a big accelerator of the rivalry. There is, I think, some hope, at least among some, particularly in the Democratic Party, that the sort of transnational challenge that COVID represents might actually serve as a mitigating factor in the China rivalry. And so when you ask people, what are the potential areas of U.S.-China competition, of U.S.-China cooperation, I should say, they often point to two. The first would be detecting and responding to future pandemics so that they do not become nearly as crippling as COVID has been. And the second is slowing and grappling with the consequences of climate change. Now, I think the first one, unfortunately, is unlikely to be an area of U.S.-China cooperation. I mean, just to be perfectly frank, China has shown literally zero interest in genuine cooperation on learning about or mitigating the spread of this pandemic, in part because I think they worry about what it would do to the legitimacy of the regime. And so if the solution, or one of the ways that you mitigate the damage of future pandemics, is through much increased transparency, I think we're not going to get that from Xi Jinping's China. And so there's unlikely to be a mitigating effect there. On climate, I think the answer is kind of maybe. And so one of the debates, I think, within the Biden administration is whether climate is sufficiently important that the United States should potentially make concessions on geopolitical issues to get Chinese cooperation to slow and mitigate the effects of climate change. I think the Biden administration decided they weren't going to do that was probably going to be a fool's errand, and it would create perverse incentives for China. But I think there is still some hope that this could serve as an area where the U.S. and China have common interests. Both of them will ultimately be in trouble, as will the rest of the world, if we have the most severe effects of climate change that are currently predicted. And so perhaps you can get cooperation there that will have a tempering effect on the overall rivalry. That's possible, but I think that's a few years down the road as well, for a couple of reasons. One is that the current American position on climate change isn't exactly set in stone. And if you get a Donald Trump presidency in 2025, the United States is going to become a lot less interested in international action on climate change. The second reason, though, is I think the Chinese haven't yet given up on the idea of linking climate to other geopolitical issues. And so when the Biden administration said in the summer of 2021, we would like to engage on climate issues, but it's separate from the rest of the relationship, the Chinese government said, oh, no, it's not, right? And if you want our constructive help on climate, you've got to address your destructive policies on Hong Kong and Taiwan and Xinjiang and you name it. And so we're at a little bit of a standoff right now. I think the Biden administration's calculus is if they hold firm, the Chinese will ultimately realize we're not going to move off our position and that it is in China's interest to cooperate with us on climate. But it remains to be seen whether that'll actually be the case.
So in terms of that compartmentalization of, hard security versus non-traditional security issues, climate change, we can have some hope at least, and pandemics probably that ship has long sailed. What about the Cold War lessons, arms control, for instance? How optimistic are you about some of these issues, which we obviously know were actually where a lot of diplomatic effort and talking went on during the Cold War years?
So I think there's good news and there's bad news if you want to look to the Cold War for lessons here. The good news is that the United States and the Soviet Union ultimately did quite a lot together to address areas of common interest. And so the nuclear non-proliferation regime, which I think has been remarkably successful in slowing the spread of nuclear weapons, was a product of primarily US-Soviet agreement during the 1960s. Around the same time, the US and the Soviet Union undertook a joint campaign through the UN to eradicate smallpox, which was then killing about 2 million people a year, mostly in the global South, and that was also very successful. There were a variety of arms control deals that emerged mostly from the late 1960s onward to cap the size and cap certain capabilities in the US and Soviet nuclear arsenals. And some of them actually were quite important. So the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was ultimately signed in late 1987, eliminated an entire class of superpower nuclear weapons. And so that was a remarkable achievement. The bad news is that you had to get through a period of pretty severe crisis before the United States and the Soviet Union concluded that it was in their interest to really tackle a lot of these issues diplomatically. And so in the late 1950s and early 1960s, you had two very dangerous crises involving Berlin, and you had, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in all three cases, there were genuine fears, not just of war, but of nuclear war between the superpowers. And it was really the experience of the Cuban crisis in particular that pushed US and Soviet leaders to start trying to set rules for the relationship and identify areas where their interests converged during the 1970s and after. The other piece of bad news was that all of the diplomacy in the world really couldn't transcend the basic difficulties and the basic differences in the US-Soviet relationship. Those differences, they were ideological, they were geopolitical, they were just very, very deeply rooted. And so the diplomacy that we often associate with the end of the Cold War was really possible mainly because the Soviets were in such a weak position and the United States had taken such a commanding position that the US was able to get a series of decidedly asymmetric deals. The INF Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the agreement leading to the reunification of Germany in 1990. And so it's really important to think about diplomacy as a tool of competition, a way of managing tensions, a way of sort of walling off certain areas of the relationship. But we can't really think of it as a substitute for competition. And I think that would have been a mistake during the Cold War, and it would be a mistake now.
And so that's a point again, by listening to all of those podcasts, which I would recommend that you listen to after you're done with our webinar today. You made this point about diplomacy not being seen as a concession or a kind of way of appeasing the competitor, but rather as an essential part of the competition, right? And maybe this is something that often, in kind of the commentary and just the kind of everyday newspaper type analysis, we see diplomacy being presented as something that is kind of an act of weakness, basically, right? So if we could sum it up then in kind of couple of sentences, your take on that, and how do you change that perception, or can you at all?
Diplomacy is not equivalent to appeasement, as you say, right? And so diplomacy can be a smart tool for keeping tensions from getting out of hand. It can be a way of shifting a competition into areas that favor you. So one of the benefits of the arms control agreements of the 1970s was that by capping the numeric arms race, they put more emphasis on the qualitative arms race, how good your nuclear weapons and your nuclear missiles were, which favored the United States. And they can be diplomacy can be a way of translating strengths that you build very patiently over time into concrete political achievements. And so the way I just like to frame it is that you should think of diplomacy as a tool in the competitive arsenal, just like military power, just like economic power, just like informational power. And so don't treat it as something that is separate or is inherently the preserve of appeasers or peaceniks, because it's not.
Excellent. And that brings me actually to the next question, which relates to net assessments. So the late and that's recently late Professor Bob Jervis liked to say that when you're analyzing your opponents, you tend to think that they are 10 feet tall and they're kind of omnipotent and that you really stand no chances. But you just talked about the various tools that the United States possesses, and certainly this kind of idea of net assessments, which I will ask you to explain rather than me standing on a soapbox and putting on an academic hat, was an invention of the Cold War period. And it's part of the various kind of bureaucratic innovations and scholarly pursuits that were taken during the Cold War. If we took that sort of approach, what does it tell us about the present state of the United States vis-a-vis its competitors, China primarily, and then Russia as we move further into the conversation?
Sure. So net assessment was, as you mentioned, a discipline that really emerged during the Cold War for comprehensively comparing the strengths and weaknesses of competitors. And it sort of got its start in comparing the damage that the US and the Soviet Union would both experience in a nuclear exchange. And then it became sort of a broader approach to military analysis during the 1970s, but then became even broader still. And so during the late 1970s, the Carter administration undertook something called the Comprehensive Net Assessment Project that basically tried to figure out where the overall balance of strengths and weaknesses lay in the Cold War. And they concluded, rightly as it turned out, that the United States was actually in a much better position than the headlines might have made you think during the late 1970s, that its power was much more broadly based and comprehensive than Soviet power was. It had real alliances, whereas the Soviet Union didn't have any real alliances by that point. And so in a long Cold War, the United States would be well equipped to succeed so long as it didn't lose the Cold War in the short term. I think that's actually really useful to keep in mind today. And so if you made me choose between having the position of Xi Jinping or having the position of the president of the United States, I'd take Joe Biden's position every day of the week and twice on Sunday, because I think that while our problems are they're out there, they are real, they are severe in certain ways, and they are the subject of discussion every day in the United States and around the world. China's problems, I think, are actually much more severe and much more potentially crippling. If you look at the demographic implosion that's coming, if you look at the debt bubble that's going to have to burst at some point, if you look at the slowdown of the economy, the number of enemies that China seems to be making, every month, every week, even in international affairs, I think China is going to have real problems catching up to the United States or achieving its geopolitical objectives over time. I think this idea that really took hold in the last decade, that China was destined to surpass the United States and we were going to get a hegemonic transition, I think that's actually quite unlikely. What I worry more about is, say, the next 10 to 20 years of the competition, because China has developed some really formidable coercive capabilities. Military power, certainly, the balance of power in the Taiwan Strait, for instance, has shifted radically in China's direction over the past 2 decades. Technological tools of coercion, economic tools of coercion as well. One of the things that's really interesting, and I don't need to explain this to an Australian audience, is that China has been applying economic sanctions and economic coercion quite liberally in disputes. What's interesting, by the way, about its current dispute with Lithuania is that it's now trying to do sort of the Chinese equivalent of American secondary sanctions, where you don't just constrain your own economic dealings with the target country, you try to constrain everybody else's economic dealings with them as well. And so the threat has been that if multinationals do business with Lithuania, they're not going to be able to do business with China, and that really is an interesting innovation, and it will be interesting to see how well it works. But the point I'm sort of working my way around to here is that I think the danger in the US-China competition is probably going to be most severe in the next, say, 10 to 15 years, because I think that's when China is going to have its best chance to upset the existing order in fairly fundamental ways, whether that's by retaking Taiwan or otherwise shifting the balance of power. And so, one of the points that I try to make in the book is that even in a competition that lasts decades, there are points where it's more intense and points when it's less intense. And I think we're actually moving into a period when the China rivalry is going to be more intense.
So the proverb of "may we live in interesting times" seems to be the one that would apply to the coming decades. So certainly it will give us plenty to analyze, to study, to write more books about. But given that we've just crossed the mark of half of our time today, I do want to move a bit to the present, actually, or get us back to the present, because there is this sort of tyranny of presentism, and I'm calling in from Europe at the moment, and all eyes seem to be on Europe, or most eyes seem to be in Europe, despite some of the travels on part of the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State, that is. But this question of, grand strategies are all well and great, but they always get muddled by reality and by the challenges of today. And certainly, Vladimir Putin is serving those very regularly, seemingly around the times of various Olympic Games. The question, first of all, in your opinion, the kind of magnitude and the scope of Russia's challenge and threat here, is it commensurate with that of China, or is it something entirely different? And how do you think this plays into the whole, aim for the United States not to be as invested in European theater and to look towards the Pacific, obviously something that it strived to do already during the Obama administration, but again, got distracted along the way?
Well, the threat from Russia is not commensurate, it's not co-equal, but it's still very serious and very important. And so it's interesting. I remember when I started writing the book, one of the most common questions I got was, why are you talking about great power competition with Russia in the same breath as great power competition with China? I think President Putin has helped me make that case over the past couple of months. He has a really remarkable tendency every time we forget that we are facing two great power competitors rather than one. He has a way of reminding us of that fact. I think the Russian and the Chinese challenges are quite different in the sense that the Chinese challenge is both greater and more comprehensive. And so China has the ability to threaten the international system, perhaps to try to upend the international system in a variety of dimensions: economic power, diplomatic influence, ideological example, military power, you name it. Russian power is more narrowly based, in part because the Russian economy is just far less impressive than the Chinese economy is. And so I don't think of Russia as posing a threat to create some sort of Russo-centric world order. I don't think that idea has much attraction for anyone outside of Russia. And I don't think Russia has the power to impose it, even if it had the desire to impose it. I think what Russia can do is to pretty fundamentally disrupt the functioning of the existing world order, whether by trying to recreate the old Soviet sphere of influence, projecting power into the Middle East or other regions, or using informational tools to meddle in political processes in Europe and the United States and other places. And we're seeing, how severe that threat can be today. And so if Vladimir Putin does mount a major invasion of Ukraine, this is going to be the biggest war that Europe has seen since World War II, most likely, in terms of the conventional use of force. It's going to create a really grave security crisis along NATO's eastern flank, and it's going to demand significantly more American attention and engagement over time. And this is where the grand strategy question becomes really interesting, because I think the Biden administration's theory of foreign policy is basically the same theory of foreign policy that every US administration has had since about 2011, which is that we need to focus less on things outside of Asia so that we can focus more on the big problem within Asia, which is China. And not once has it turned out like we planned. And so the Obama administration's pivot to Asia was derailed by, wait for it, a crisis in Ukraine and a crisis in the Middle East. The Trump administration's pivot to competition with China was complicated by its confrontation with Iran. And now we're dealing with the very same issues today. And so I think the reality, and here's an interesting Cold War parallel, we may be where we were in sort of the late 1940s, where the United States had established a global system of commitments to various countries that it meant to protect from communist influence, but really didn't have the resources to do it if those commitments were tested. And I worry we're in a little bit of a similar situation right now, where we have a foreign policy that we try to focus more and more regionally on the biggest problem, which is China, which is natural. But the reality is that we still have these very important commitments in other regions. And when they are threatened, we feel as though we have to pull back and focus on them. So that's a little bit of the trap that we've gotten ourselves stuck in so far. And I think that the Biden administration is experiencing that same thing today.
And another thing that I would add is a bit similar to those early years of the Cold War is the chumminess between Putin and Xi, right? I've heard you make this point, but I would like to hear your thoughts on just the sort of, alignment or alliance between Russia and China, and especially what we've seen on part of the Biden administration prior to the most recent buildup of Russia's troops on its western borders and around Ukraine. And that was basically this effort to try to engage with Russia, to find areas of cooperation even, right? That I think if I got you right, you're not that optimistic about, at least not in the short run. Why so?
So there's an interesting factoid I heard the other day, which is that the Russian Far East is now more denuded of military assets than at any time since 1941, when German forces were literally at the gates of Moscow. Of course, this is related to the buildup vis-a-vis Ukraine, but it testifies to the security that Russia feels vis-a-vis China, which is really quite remarkable. I mean, one of the reasons that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War is that it ended up fighting a two-front struggle against the West and against China, and it couldn't bear that. Now Russia is really able to focus its energies on the West and on Ukraine because it doesn't face any meaningful security threats or even political challenges from China. This is a problem for the United States, and we're seeing more and more cooperation between our two chief adversaries. And so the geometry of triangular diplomacy is definitely not working in our favor these days. This is one of the reasons why, again, both of the last two administrations, heck, even the Obama administration before that, really, I think, tried to put US-Russia relations on a more stable footing. There wasn't a reset this time around, but I think there was a hope that you could create greater stability in the relationship in a way that would allow you to deprioritize Europe a little bit and focus more on China. I think, that's not necessarily based on a hope that you can split the two countries apart, sort of pull the reverse Kissinger and make Putin your ally vis-a-vis Xi Jinping. I think people mostly realize that that's unrealistic, but you at least want to limit the liability in one theater so you can focus on another. I think that the problem is that it's just incompatible with what Putin wants. And so the question that emerges is, what price would you have to pay to get relations with Russia in a good enough place that you were no longer worried about crises on NATO's eastern flank? Well, we know the answer to that, right? Because the Russian foreign ministry gave us the draft treaties in December, and those were outlining basically what Putin's price would be, not to come to a comprehensive détente with the United States, but just not to invade Ukraine, right? And the price that he specified was basically roll back NATO's posture to where it was in 1997 and do things that would really sever some of the links between the United States and Europe, like stop stationing relinquish the right to station nuclear weapons on American nuclear weapons on European soil. And the Biden administration has obviously rejected that out of hand. And so I think that the real problem is just that we face parallel challenges and increasingly convergent challenges between Russia and China right now. And so we're probably looking at a dual containment type mission for the next 10 to 15 years. That could change over time. I mean, one of the things that did happen eventually during the Cold War is that the Soviets and the Chinese got really sick of each other, and they had a big falling out in the 1960s that opened the door to a much better Sino-American relationship. There are still some historical tensions between China and Russia. There are areas such as Central Asia where it's possible their interests could come into conflict. There's not a lot of deep love between the two countries, but I think that's a relatively distant prospect. I think we're talking about something that would happen after Putin leaves power, because his confrontation with the West is pretty thoroughly personalized at this point. And so it's not a possibility that we can avail ourselves of anytime soon. The one bit of good news is that the US plus its allies in Europe plus its allies in the Indo-Pacific still outweighs Russia and China together by a significant margin, geopolitically, economically, and so on and so forth. And so it's a hard thing to do, but it's not impossible.
And we'll get to the question of allies in a second, but I wanted to address one of the questions that we received also in the Q&A box and that I had jotted down, which is one on the lessons from Ukraine and its implications for Taiwan. And if I'm not mistaken, this is also a subject of your latest column for Bloomberg. So if you could give us a sneak peek for those that don't have subscription.
Sure, absolutely. So the first thing I think it's important to make clear in any discussion of Ukraine and Taiwan is that the situations are not perfectly analogous by any means. And it's important to avoid the trap that we sometimes fall into of saying, okay, if we don't prevent Putin from doing something bad vis-a-vis Ukraine, then Xi Jinping is going to do something bad vis-a-vis Taiwan the next day. I think if Xi Jinping does decide to use a greater degree of coercion or force vis-a-vis Taiwan, it will be for his own reasons on his own timetable. But there are, I think, some interesting lessons that we can draw from one crisis and apply to the Taiwan situation. And so, the Ukraine crisis has in some ways served as a test case of whether the United States and its allies can preload sanctions that it would use to punish aggression against an important country. I think that that same approach would probably figure pretty prominently if China were to attack Taiwan, not necessarily as a substitute for a direct defense of Taiwan, but perhaps as a complement. And again, I think there's good news and bad news here. I think the good news is that we've seen that it is possible to a degree. The bad news is that we've seen that it's hard, even among close allies, to get agreement on what those sanctions might be. I think the Ukraine crisis makes an argument for beefing up the U.S. and allied military posture near Taiwan before a crisis begins, because it will become more sensitive and more difficult to do that once a crisis unfolds. I think it shows us things about the importance of deeper cooperation to address cyber threats in Taiwan, because we see the way that Ukraine is being subjected to cyber coercion today. And there are a variety of other things as well. And so it's not necessarily the case that these situations are the same. They're not. But when we think about things that we might need to do to help Ukraine preserve its status against a sharper Chinese threat, we can draw some useful lessons from the Ukraine crisis.
That's great. And given that we have around 10 minutes left or so, I'm going to fast forward to the role of allies and partners. And then maybe if we have time, and I hope we do, to address some of the kind of in-between countries and maybe the sort of analogy to the non-aligned of the Cold War. So you already actually alluded to this question around the buy-in from allies. I think when it comes to, again, Cold War mythologizing it, as you called it, we do tend to sometimes overstate the buy-in from US allies and the kind of unity and command structure. We've already, for students of history, for sure, 60s, for instance, tend to be the kind of interesting time. So fast forward to today, we definitely have seen that some of the foremost US allies have come to the same sort of diagnosis of the challenges that are posed by China and to an extent by Russia. We are kind of getting there. But there is still plenty of them who aren't completely sold or have really legitimate economic interests in not seeing the competition sharpen. Lessons from the Cold War. How have some of these crises in terms of the intra-alliance relations been managed, and what can they tell us for today?
Yeah, so I think the big lesson, it kind of goes back to Churchill's famous comment that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And so we often forget just how brutal the intra-alliance fights were during the Cold War. I mean, the United States was constantly threatening to pick up and leave the Europeans defend for themselves if they didn't, approve German rearmament or, and this sounds very familiar, pay us more money to offset the cost of our military presence. That was a big issue in the U.S.-German relationship in the 1960s, and wouldn't you know it, it remains an issue today. And if you go back to the Siberian pipeline dispute in the early 1980s, there are really clear echoes. I guess the Nord Stream 2 debate, there are really clear echoes of the earlier pipeline dispute then. And so the question was never, could you get perfect coordination or cooperation from your allies? It was, could you get enough to maintain some degree of cohesion against a common threat? And the answer was yes. And one of the reasons the answer was yes was because the United States and its allies, frankly, just worked tirelessly at alliance management during the Cold War. And so, this was a preoccupation of every American president and every American secretary of state. And we invested a lot in developing deeply institutionalized alliances, in part because that institutionalization could help promote cooperation and sort of tamp down the tensions when political relationships were frayed. And so, we were ultimately successful in holding the free world together during the Cold War. In some ways, the challenge is a little bit more difficult now because the geography, say, of the US-China competition is so different. And so, Korea and Australia are both US allies. They don't have the same threat perceptions vis-a-vis China. They're a long way apart. And neither of them has the same threat perception that Taiwan does, which is not a US ally, but is sort of an ambiguous partner of sorts. The second reason is that China has more tools of economic attraction and coercion than the Soviet Union did. And so it is better able to play on the differences between allies than the Soviet Union was. Even Putin does it better than the Soviet Union did with more limited resources. That said, I think that we're moving in the right direction. And maybe I'll just talk about China for reasons of time. If you think about the degree of multilateral cooperation there is vis-a-vis China now compared to what it was 5 years ago, it's just night and day difference. The Quad was revived and now is like a real thing, as opposed to just sort of a talking point. AUKUS, I think, has significant potential over the long term, although we're still trying to figure out sort of exactly what the payoff from that will be. You see the Japanese and the Australian governments talking more explicitly and more assertively about the role they might play in a Taiwan crisis. And so we're unlikely to get an Asian NATO or an Indo-Pacific NATO or something that looks exactly like a Cold War model. But I think we're getting sort of more and more overlapping areas of allied and partner cooperation vis-a-vis China. And that's really important in shaping the system so that it constrains Chinese assertiveness.
That's excellent. Again, mindful of time here, I'm going to try to combine actually these two questions where for a long time in terms of Australian political discourse, we've heard this line that there's nothing wrong with having US as the major security ally and China is a major trading partner, right? And obviously that kind of discourse came to a halt precisely because of the change in paradigm when it comes to the makeup of the international system. And obviously this being the era of great power rivalry. If you were to advise, say, Australian government, and this is some, gratuitous advice at the moment, but I hope they find a way to remunerate you. What would be the kind of key things that you would stress as the lessons that middle powers such as Australia can take and the way they can chart their course forward?
Well, it would certainly be unsolicited advice at the very least. But I think I guess one point I would make is that we often understate the importance of medium power allies and great power competitions. I mean, there's a tendency to focus on the US and Soviet Union in the Cold War, the US and China today. But the reality is that most great power competitions are competitions over the loyalties of and influence with third countries, right? And those can be, frontline states like Taiwan or Ukraine. They can be close allies like Japan or Australia, which means that the capabilities those countries can bring to bear economically, diplomatically, militarily are quite important. The second way in which I think sort of medium-sized allies are quite important is they sometimes bring regional expertise to bear that the United States does not have. And so you could think about, for instance, the South Pacific as an area that's going to be very important to US-China cooperation, where Australia may very well have deeper relationships and a better feel for events than the United States does. And so you can get a very productive division of labor, or at least mutually reinforcing efforts in some of these areas. And then I guess the final point I would make is that I think one of the things that the US government is going to be looking for, regardless of who is the next president, this isn't a Trump, it's not a Biden thing, is probably a greater degree of reciprocity in its relationships with allies in the Indo-Pacific in particular. And this can take destructive forms, like when we hector the South Koreans and try to, hold them upside down and shake them so that more money falls out of their pockets and the host nation support agreements. It can also take constructive forms where we have very candid discussions with, say, the Japanese, and we say, okay, what's the flip side of Article 5 in our treaty arrangement? What will you do to help if our bases are attacked in the Western Pacific? And I think there are similar conversations that could be had with Australia or other US allies as well. And so those are three areas, I think, in which Australia is poised to play a very important role in this competition.
And I'll use the moderator's prerogative for a very quick final question around Cold War analogies. Do you see any space for states or blocks of states remaining non-aligned, for instance? Or this term, I think Bruce Gentleson, who's a professor at Duke University, I think you've spent some time there, has said that there is this kind of phenomenon of pluralization of diplomacy, that some countries, who are American allies still develop relations with China, with Russia, actually. Do you see this being kind of an exception, or do you think we will have some sort of emergence of a kind of different kind of a block of states that are forced to do that because obviously these days your security competitor might actually be your trading partner, which is quite unlike the Cold War period?
So for exactly that reason, I think we're unlikely to get as stark a division of the international environment as we had during the Cold War. Although I do actually think that the momentum of the US-China rivalry is going to carry us towards a more bifurcated world than we probably imagine at the moment. If you look at the ways in which technological systems are likely to fragment along geopolitical lines, for instance, you definitely could see more of a shift toward bipolarity. But even in that circumstance, there will be lots of countries that will see an opportunity either to straddle the fence, or even better, from their perspective, to play both sides against each other. And so, we may see an example of countries that say, try to get support from the United States and sort of hint that if we don't give it, then China might end up with a military base in that country, or that seek loans and development assistance from one side with the implied or explicit threat that they may go the other way if they don't get what they want. This is normal. This happened all the time during the Cold War. There were states that were truly masters of this thing. Yugoslavia, of course, was a very successful pioneer of the non-aligned movement, and Tito was one of the most ruthless practitioners of geopolitics that we saw during the second half of the 20th century. And so precisely because this competition is going to be a competition over the loyalty of third parties, it will create lots of space for interesting maneuvering on the part of those countries.
Hal, thank you so much for this. We are just making it before the top of the hour. This has been most interesting and educational webinar. Thank you for showing us at least a glimpse of your book, which I would encourage everyone to buy and read. And I'm also glad that we managed to at least refer to some of the interesting developments on the infrastructure diplomacy front. Plenty there to think and talk about and to study about, which we also do at the US Study Center. But for now, again, a huge thanks for spending an hour of your busy day with us. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
And for all of you who have joined us, I hope that you'll be able to join us at our next webinar, which is going to take place on March 1st. It is going to be a webinar that actually previews Biden's first State of the Union address, and my colleagues David Smith, Bruce Wolpe, and Victoria Cooper will be previewing it in conversation with our CEO, Simon Jackman, on March 1st. Which is a Tuesday between 10 and 11 a.m. Stay safe, stay well, everyone, and I look forward to another one of these webinars, and hopefully we get to do some of these things in person before too long. For now, that's it from us.